I didn't find out I wasn't invited. No one sat me down. No one said the words. No one had the courage to tell me I didn't belong in their plans anymore. I realized it quietly. The way most humiliations arrive, without warning, without witnesses, and without apology. I was standing in my kitchen, still in my house slippers, the kettle screaming on the stove because I'd forgotten about it. My phone buzzed on the counter. Just another notification. Nothing urgent, nothing important. Or so I thought. It was a photo. My son, his wife, the kids, smiling, airport background, suitcases lined up neatly at their feet. Someone had added a caption underneath, "Family time at last." I stared at the screen longer than I should have. I zoomed in, once, twice, looking for something. My name, maybe. A hint, a sign that I was late to the conversation, not excluded from it. But there was nothing. No message asking if I was ready. No, "Mom, did you pack?" No, "We'll pick you up on the way." Just faces already moving forward, without me. I scrolled up, group chat, photos from the night before, suitcases in the hallway, someone joking about forgetting their passport. Everyone had known, everyone except me. That was the moment it settled in. Not like anger, not like sadness, more like a weight. A slow, sinking realization pressing against my chest. They hadn't forgotten to invite me. They had planned the entire trip without ever considering me. I leaned against the counter, suddenly aware of how quiet the house was. No children running through the hall, no raised voices, no laughter, just the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of my own breathing. I replayed the last few weeks in my head, the way conversations had shifted when I walked into the room, the vague answers when I asked about their summer plans, the casual, "Oh, nothing special," said a little too quickly. I remembered laughing it off, telling myself I was imagining things. After all, families don't just leave people behind, do they? Especially not mothers, especially not the woman who had always been there when they needed someone to stay behind. I picked up my phone again. Still nothing. No message saying, "We didn't think you'd want to go." No excuse about space or money or timing. Nothing at all. That silence said more than any explanation ever could. I set the phone down and turned off the kettle. The water had boiled away, leaving a dry, angry hiss. I poured it out and stood there, holding the empty mug like it might give me answers. I thought about asking. I could have called my son right then. I could have said, "I saw the pictures." I could have forced him to explain himself. But something stopped me. Because I already knew the answer. If I wasn't invited, it wasn't an accident. It was a decision. And decisions like that don't happen overnight. They happen quietly, in private conversations, in moments where someone says, "It'll be easier this way." Easier without me. I didn't cry. That surprised me. Instead, I felt exposed. Like someone had removed a chair I'd been sitting on for years, and only now did I realize I'd been hovering just above the ground the entire time. I had always assumed I was part of the picture. Turns out I was just the one holding the camera. I picked up my phone one last time. The photo was still there, their smiles unchanged, their bags already packed. And that was when the truth finally settled in. I didn't find out I wasn't invited. I realized it when everyone else was already gone. Not because I was asked, not because it was written down anywhere, but because somehow it became understood. When they needed someone to watch the kids, I stayed. When someone had to miss the trip, the dinner, the weekend away, I stayed. When plans were made and someone said, "We'll figure it out," I was already the solution. I didn't remember choosing that role. It chose me. I remember the first time it happened. It didn't feel like sacrifice then. It felt temporary, reasonable, almost generous. They were tired. They were young parents. They deserved a break. I told myself I'd rest next time. There was always a next time. Trips came and went, short ones at first. A weekend here, a few days there. I stayed behind with a packed fridge, a written schedule taped to the wall, and a house that was suddenly much louder and much emptier at the same time. The children would ask where their parents were. "Vacation," I'd say. Just for a few days. I learned how to say it with a smile. I learned how to say it without sounding tired. I became good at it. good at filling in the gaps, good at adjusting my sleep, good at pretending I didn't mind. Sometimes, late at night, when the kids were finally asleep, I would sit on the couch and scroll through my phone. Photos would appear. Beach sunsets, restaurant tables, laughing faces. I would double-tap the screen, almost automatically. It never occurred to me to ask why I wasn't there, because in my mind, my absence had already been justified. Someone had to stay. And I was someone. Over time, it stopped being discussed altogether. No one asked if I was free. No one asked if I was tired. No one asked if I wanted a turn. Plans would be mentioned casually. We're thinking of going away for a few days. We found a good deal. The kids will be fine with you, right? Always phrased like a question, never meant as one. And I would nod. Of course I would. Because saying no felt heavier than staying. Because saying no would require an explanation, and I didn't want to be the difficult one, the ungrateful one, the mother who complained. So I stayed. I stayed when my knees ached from lifting toddlers. I stayed when my nights were short and my mornings came too early. I stayed when my friends stopped calling because I was always busy. Busy was a polite word. What it really meant was unavailable for myself. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself this was just a season. I told myself one day they'd notice. But seasons have a way of becoming climates. And before I realized it, staying wasn't something I did. It was who I was. The one who held the routine together. The one who kept the house running. The one who made sure life didn't fall apart while others stepped away from it. I didn't ask for credit. I didn't expect thanks. I just assumed I was included. Included not in the trips, maybe, but in the family. That assumption felt solid, unquestionable. After all, I was the one they relied on, the one they trusted, the one who made their freedom possible. I stayed behind so they could move forward. I said those words to myself many times, like a rule, like a truth. And for a long time, I believed that staying meant belonging, that even if I wasn't seen, I was still part of the picture. I didn't notice when the invitations stopped coming, because they had never really started. I didn't notice when my role stopped being temporary, because no one announced the change. I didn't notice when my presence became optional, because I had trained myself to disappear quietly. By the time I finally realized what staying had cost me, it had already become expected. And expectations, once formed, are hard to undo, especially when you're the one who taught them. There came a point when staying no longer felt noble. It felt routine. The days blurred together, school drop-offs, packed lunches, laundry folded while cartoons played in the background. I memorized nap schedules better than my own appointments. I knew which child cried at night, which one needed the light left on, which one woke up hungry at dawn. I knew their lives intimately, and somehow mine grew smaller around the edges. I stopped planning things far ahead. There was no point. Something always came up. Someone always needed me. And even when no one said it out loud, I could hear the unspoken assumption, she'll be there. So I stayed. I canceled lunches with friends. I postponed checkups. I let invitations expire without answering. It was easier than explaining why I couldn't go. It was easier than admitting that my availability wasn't kindness anymore. It was expectation. Every once in a while, someone would say, "You're amazing for doing all this." I learned to smile at that too. Because admiration didn't come with relief. Praise didn't come with replacement. They could say I was important and still plan their lives without me in them. I didn't notice it at first, but slowly, my presence stopped being acknowledged. They would come home sunburned and relaxed, talking over each other about flights and hotels and views I would never see. I listened from the kitchen, stirring something on the stove, nodding at the right moments. "How was it?" I'd ask. "Great," they'd say, and that would be the end of it. No one asked if I had enjoyed my week. No one asked if I was tired. It didn't occur to them that I might have wanted something different, because I had never said so. I told myself that this was what mothers did, that this was love, that this was my role now. And maybe it was. But roles have a way of solidifying when no one questions them. I noticed it in small things. the way my schedule was assumed to be flexible, the way plans were announced instead of discussed, the way decisions were made around me, not with me. I noticed that when people talked about family time, it no longer automatically included me. I was family, yes, but I was also infrastructure, necessary, reliable, invisible. There were moments, quiet ones, when I felt it most, late evenings after everyone had left, when the house finally settled into silence. I would sit alone and feel the weight of the day catch up to me. Not exhaustion exactly. Something deeper, a sense that my life was happening in the margins of someone else's. I wondered what it would feel like to be the one packing a suitcase. I wondered what it would feel like to be missed. Those thoughts came with guilt, because wanting more felt selfish, because I had trained myself to believe that wanting meant taking something away from someone else. So I pushed the thoughts aside. I stayed busy enough not to think, busy enough not to feel. The truth is, I never asked, "What about me?" Not once. I didn't ask because asking would have forced an answer, and answers can be dangerous when you're not ready to hear them. I didn't want to know if they had stopped seeing me as part of the plan. I didn't want to know if my staying had quietly rewritten my place in their lives, so I told myself stories instead, that they needed me, that this phase would pass, that one day I'd be the one going. But deep down, something had already shifted. I could feel it in the way my absence would barely register if I left the room, in the way my presence was noticed only when something needed to be done. I wasn't angry, not yet. I was tired of being dependable, tired of being assumed, tired of being the answer no one bothered to ask for, and still, I stayed. Because staying had become instinct, because leaving felt like a language I had never learned to speak. I didn't know then that staying, unquestioned, uninterrupted, had taught them something important, that I would always be there, that I didn't need to be invited, that I would adjust. That lesson would come back to me later, in a way I couldn't ignore. I didn't notice the change all at once. It happened gradually, quietly, the way things do when no one wants to draw attention to what they're doing. Conversations didn't stop when I walked into the room, but they softened, shifted direction, lost their edges. Details disappeared. Sentences ended early. People spoke in summaries instead of specifics, as if the important parts had already been discussed somewhere else. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Families get busy, plans overlap, people forget what they've already said. I had made excuses for others my entire life. This felt familiar, almost comforting, but something about it lingered. A pattern I couldn't unsee once it formed. I noticed it one evening at dinner. Nothing dramatic, just a normal night, the kind I had hosted countless times before. The table was full, plates half empty, conversation drifting lazily from topic to topic. Summer came up. Not directly, not clearly, just hints. Someone mentioning airfare prices, someone else complaining about crowds, a passing comment about how fast time was moving. Then my daughter-in-law looked at me and smiled. It was quick, practiced, the kind of smile that arrives before the sentence it's meant to soften. "You don't really like traveling anyway," she said casually, as if recalling a shared memory. "You always say it's tiring." It wasn't phrased as a question. It didn't invite correction. It landed like a conclusion already agreed upon. I paused for a moment, my fork resting against the plate, my mind searching for the version of myself she was referencing. I had said traveling tired me, yes, but years ago when my body was still healing, when rest was necessary, not a preference. I had never said I didn't enjoy it. I had never said I didn't want to go. Before I could respond, she continued, her tone gentle, almost affectionate. "We just worry about you. All that moving around. It's a lot." My son nodded beside her. Not thoughtfully, not hesitantly. Just a small, automatic motion, like someone confirming a fact they didn't feel the need to examine. The moment passed quickly. Too quickly. Conversation moved on, plates clinked, someone laughed. I smiled because that's what I'd learned to do when something felt wrong but not yet confrontational enough to challenge. Later that night, I replayed the exchange in my head. Not the words themselves, but the structure of them. No one had asked how I felt about traveling now. No one had asked if I wanted to go. They had reached back into an old version of me, pulled out a convenient detail, and used it to justify a decision made in the present. That was when I started paying attention. Similar comments appeared in the weeks that followed, always framed as concern, always polite, always delivered with a smile. You wouldn't enjoy that kind of trip. It's a lot of walking. We thought it'd be easier for you to stay home. Easier. That word came up often. It floated through conversations like an answer that required no follow-up. Easier for whom? I noticed how plans were no longer shared openly, only referenced afterward. We already talked about it. We figured it out. We assumed you'd be okay. Assumed. Another word that settled uncomfortably in my mind. Assumptions remove the need for permission. They turn people into background details rather than participants. I began to realize that this wasn't forgetfulness. It was coordination. Quiet, efficient, carefully managed coordination. No arguments, no raised voices, just a shared understanding that decisions could be made without me. And the most unsettling part was how natural it all seemed to them. They weren't trying to hurt me. They weren't even trying to exclude me, not consciously. They were simply managing around me, shaping plans to fit the version of me they had decided on. The one who stayed, the one who didn't mind, the one who didn't need to be consulted. I asked myself when I had given them that impression. The answer came slowly, and it wasn't easy to accept. Every time I said, "Whatever works." Every time I said, "It's fine." Every time I stayed quiet instead of asking to be included. Silence, I realized, teaches people what they're allowed to do, and I had been silent for a very long time. Lying awake one night, I thought about how carefully everything had been worded. Not, "You're not invited." Not, "We don't want you to come." Just concern. Just protection. Just someone else deciding what was best for me. That was when the thought finally settled in, heavy and undeniable. They didn't ask if I wanted to go. They decided I shouldn't. And they had done it so smoothly, so quietly, that for a while I almost believed it was my idea. After that, I stopped responding the way I used to, not outwardly. I still smiled, still nodded, still played the role they expected. But something inside me shifted. I began to listen differently, not to understand, but to notice, not to agree, but to remember. I noticed how often my daughter-in-law spoke for me, not loudly, not aggressively, but smoothly, as if translating my thoughts before I had a chance to form them myself. She wouldn't like that. It's too much for her. She prefers staying home. Each sentence sounded reasonable on its own. Together they formed a version of me I didn't recognize anymore. What unsettled me wasn't the content of her words, it was the confidence with which she said them. As if my preferences were settled facts, as if my voice was no longer required to confirm them. My son rarely contradicted her. He didn't need to. Silence worked just as well. His agreement lived in his lack of interruption, in the way he let her sentences land and settle without question. Watching them, I realized decisions weren't being debated. They were being reinforced, and I was no longer part of that process. There were moments when I tested the space, gently, carefully. A small comment, a light suggestion, nothing confrontational, just enough to see what would happen. Each time the response came quickly, wrapped in concern and practicality. "That sounds nice, but it might be a lot for you. We just don't want you to feel pressured. You know how tired you get." Pressure. Another word that appeared out of nowhere, applied to me without my consent. As if wanting to be included was a burden. As if my presence complicated things. So I stopped testing. Instead, I watched. I watched how plans were finalized before I ever heard about them. How details emerged only when they were irreversible. Flights booked, accommodations chosen, schedules locked in. By the time information reached me, it arrived as a summary, not a discussion. We already decided. We thought this would be best. We didn't want to bother you. Bother. That word stayed with me longer than the others because it revealed something important. My involvement wasn't unwanted, it was inconvenient. My voice wasn't dangerous, it was unnecessary. I began to understand the efficiency of what they were doing. Asking me would mean waiting for an answer. Including me would mean adjusting plans. Listening to me would mean accepting the possibility that I might want something different. Silence avoided all of that, and I had made silence easy for them. I realized then that this wasn't about travel, or vacations, or logistics. It was about control, not the loud kind, not the obvious kind, but the quiet kind that grows when one person's needs are consistently prioritized over another's presence. They weren't pushing me away, they were shrinking me, reducing me to a predictable role, someone manageable, someone whose preferences could be summarized in advance. I wondered how long this had been happening without my noticing. How many decisions had been made around me while I stood just close enough to believe I was still included. I thought about the way my daughter-in-law framed everything as concern. How difficult it would be to challenge that without sounding ungrateful. How easily I could be made to look unreasonable for wanting a say in my own life. That was the brilliance of it. Nothing she said could be argued without effort. Nothing she did could be confronted without friction. And I had spent years avoiding friction, so I did what I had always done best. I stayed quiet. But this time, my silence wasn't empty. It was deliberate. I listened to the pauses. I watched the glances. I noted who spoke first, who nodded, who decided. I paid attention to what was said in front of me and what was clearly discussed elsewhere. I stopped offering myself as the solution, stopped filling in gaps before they were acknowledged, and in that quiet observation, something became clear. They had grown comfortable making decisions without me because I had made myself optional, not by choice, by habit. And habits, once established, rarely change unless something disrupts them. I didn't know yet what that disruption would be, but I knew this much. The silence around me wasn't accidental, it was intentional, and once I saw it that way, I couldn't unsee it. The truth didn't arrive all at once. It revealed itself piece by piece, each detail quietly closing another door I hadn't realized was still open. I didn't hear it directly from them. No one came to me with honesty. No one said, "We planned a trip without you." That would have required courage. Instead, the truth slipped through the cracks of everyday conversation, carried by carelessness, by the confidence of people who believed their choices no longer needed to be hidden. It started with dates. Someone mentioned how hard it had been to get time off work. Another complained about prices going up the closer summer got. I listened without reacting, letting the information settle, arranging itself in my mind. These weren't vague ideas anymore. They were commitments. Time had been requested, money had been spent, plans had moved beyond possibility. Then came the details, flights, discussed casually, as if everyone in the room already knew. Early departure, layovers, complaints about seats not reclining properly. I remember the exact moment my chest tightened, not dramatically, not painfully, but enough to signal that something important had shifted, because you don't complain about seats unless you already have one. I stayed quiet. I had learned that silence invited people to reveal more than questions ever could. A few days later, I saw the confirmation emails by accident, open on a laptop left unattended on the kitchen table, not hidden, not protected. There was no need. They had nothing to fear from me asking questions they assumed I wouldn't. I didn't read every word. I didn't need to. Names stood out immediately. My son, my daughter-in-law, the children, listed clearly, efficiently. And then I noticed what wasn't there. My name. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, waiting for it to appear as if delayed by some technical error. A second page, perhaps. An add-on. Something that would correct the discomfort spreading through me. But the list ended where it ended. There was no extra ticket, no pending reservation, no "we'll book yours later." They hadn't forgotten to include me. They had completed the booking without me. Later that same day, I overheard a conversation about accommodations. Rooms had been chosen, beds assigned. Someone joked about kids fighting over who slept where. Laughter followed, easy and unrestrained. I did the math in my head without meaning to. There was no empty bed, no flexible arrangement, no, we'll make it work. Every space had been accounted for, except mine. That was when the final illusion collapsed. This wasn't an oversight. It wasn't poor communication. It wasn't even avoidance. It was exclusion, finalized and paid for. I felt strangely calm in that moment, not numb, clear, as if my body had decided there was no benefit left in pretending. The question I had avoided asking answered itself. They hadn't been waiting to see how I felt. They had already decided how I fit into the plan, which was, I didn't. I thought about all the small comments from weeks before, the concern, the smiles, the assurances that it would be too much for me, how carefully those words had been chosen to soften what was already in motion. I thought about how unnecessary it would have been to ask my opinion after the tickets were bought. Asking implies possibility. And there had been none. That realization hurt more than any argument ever could, because arguments suggest conflict. This suggested consensus, quiet agreement, a shared understanding that my absence was acceptable, preferred even. I didn't confront them, not then, because confrontation requires uncertainty, and I had none left. There was no extra seat, because there was never meant to be one for me. I walked away from the table and into the quiet of my room, closing the door behind me. The house felt different, smaller. Not because space had changed, but because my place within it had. I sat down and let the truth settle fully. I hadn't been forgotten. I had been planned around. After that, everything looked different, even though nothing around me had actually changed. The same walls, the same table, the same familiar routines I had kept running for years. But once the truth settled in, it rewrote every memory connected to them. I replayed the past with new clarity. All the times I had stayed behind so others could leave. All the moments I had told myself it was temporary, that my turn would come later. I saw now how easily my sacrifices had been folded into expectation, how my presence had slowly transformed from valued to assumed. It wasn't that they didn't need me anymore. They simply didn't need to consider me. That distinction mattered more than I wanted it to. I thought about the effort it would have taken to include me. One more ticket, one more room, one more conversation. None of those things were impossible. They were just inconvenient. And inconvenience, I realized, was something they no longer believed I was entitled to cause. I didn't feel anger right away. Anger implies surprise. This felt like confirmation. A quiet, heavy understanding that the role I had accepted for so long had finally reached its logical conclusion. If I existed primarily to support their lives, then my absence from their pleasures made sense. Support doesn't need a seat, it needs availability. That thought stayed with me longer than it should have. I noticed how naturally they spoke about the trip afterward. No hesitation, no discomfort, no glance in my direction to check how I might be feeling. Their ease told me everything I needed to know. Guilt requires awareness. And they felt none. I wondered if any of them had paused, even briefly, to consider how it would look from my side, if anyone had thought about how it might feel to be excluded without explanation. The answer, I suspected, was no, not because they were cruel, because they were comfortable. Comfort dulls empathy, and I had contributed to that comfort for years. The realization didn't break me, it clarified me. I understood now why the conversations had softened, why plans had been discussed elsewhere, why my preferences had been summarized without my input. All of it had been preparation, not conscious perhaps, but effective. They had been easing me out of the picture long before I noticed. And once I saw that, I stopped trying to reinsert myself. I stopped waiting for an apology that wasn't coming. Because apologies require acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would mean admitting that something had been taken from me without asking. That wasn't a conversation they were prepared to have. I felt something close to grief then, but not for the trip. I grieved the assumption I had carried for so long, that being necessary meant being included, that being reliable meant being respected. I saw now how easily one could exist in a family and still be peripheral. I had become a fixture, useful, dependable, replaceable, and fixtures don't get invited, they get worked around. There was a strange calm that followed that thought. Not relief, not acceptance, but a narrowing of focus. A sense that something had ended, whether anyone else recognized it or not. I didn't confront them. I didn't announce my hurt. I didn't demand explanations, because the truth had already been delivered in full. There was no extra seat. There never had been. And once that was clear, there was nothing left to argue about. I went to bed that night earlier than usual, not from exhaustion, but from clarity, the kind that closes doors quietly, without ceremony. I lay there in the dark, listening to the familiar sounds of a house that suddenly felt less like mine. I understood then that what hurt wasn't the exclusion itself. It was the ease with which it had happened, the certainty with which they had moved forward, confident that I would stay behind as I always had. That confidence would not last. But they didn't know that yet. And I didn't need to tell them. After that night, I stopped asking questions, not because I didn't care anymore, but because I finally understood that questions were no longer useful. Asking why only invited explanations I couldn't verify, asking how only opened doors they controlled. I had spent too many years accepting answers that sounded reasonable but changed nothing. So I did something different. I stayed quiet, and I started to observe. I paid attention to what moved automatically in this household: money, time, responsibility, and how naturally it flowed in one direction. Toward them. Away from me. I watched how often my name appeared only when something needed to be handled, fixed, covered. I noticed how rarely anyone asked what I needed. That observation alone changed the way I listened. I began with the practical things, the ones I had always considered background noise, bills, transfers, shared expenses that had slowly shifted from occasional help to permanent expectation. I opened drawers I hadn't looked into in years, pulled out folders I had kept out of habit rather than awareness, statements stacked neatly, month after month. I read them slowly, not with panic, not with anger, with curiosity. I saw patterns I had never questioned, automatic payments I no longer remembered authorizing, contributions I had assumed were temporary but had quietly become permanent. Small amounts at first, then larger ones, all justified under the same unspoken rule. I'll handle it. I asked myself a simple question. When did helping become covering? That question led to others. What exactly was I still paying for? Who depended on my silence to keep things running smoothly? What would happen if I stopped? I didn't answer those questions yet. I just let them exist. I paid attention to how often plans relied on my availability without confirming it, how my time was treated as flexible by default, how my role was referenced indirectly, as if it were a constant that didn't require maintenance. She'll manage. She always does. It's easier if she handles it. Easier. That word again. Easier for them meant invisible labor for me. I began to see how comfort had been built on top of my predictability, how their sense of security depended on my consistency, my reliability, my refusal to disrupt the rhythm they had grown used to. They didn't need to control me overtly. They just needed me to remain the same. And I had been doing exactly that. So instead of confronting them, I started confronting the structure. I listed responsibilities, childcare, financial support, scheduling, emotional buffering, and asked myself which of them I had chosen and which had simply landed on me because I never pushed them away. The list was longer than I expected. Some items surprised me, others made sense immediately. None of them had been formally discussed. They had accumulated over time, built on the assumption that I would adapt, that I would adjust, that I would absorb whatever was added without complaint. I realized then how dangerous assumptions could be when left unchallenged. They don't feel like demands. They feel like gravity. And gravity only becomes noticeable when you try to move against it. I didn't try to move yet. I just measured the weight. I reviewed accounts tied to my name, commitments that extended beyond my own needs, promises I had made casually and never revisited. I noticed how often temporary had turned into indefinite. How rarely anyone checked if I was still comfortable carrying the load. Comfort had never been the point. Reliability was, and reliability, once proven, becomes expected. I also noticed something else. They didn't monitor what I did with my money. They assumed. They assumed I would continue. They assumed nothing would change. They assumed my silence meant agreement. That assumption gave me space. And space gave me clarity. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't reacting. I wasn't defending myself. I wasn't explaining. I wasn't asking for understanding. I was simply looking at the reality I had helped build and deciding whether I still wanted to live inside it. I stopped asking why things were the way they were, because the answer didn't matter anymore. What mattered was what I was still paying for, and whether I intended to keep paying. Once I understood the structure, I didn't rush to change it. Sudden moves attract attention, and attention invites resistance. I had no interest in explaining myself or negotiating terms I had never agreed to in the first place, so I started small. Not enough for anyone to notice at first, just enough for me to feel the shift. I delayed responses. Not ignored, delayed. Messages that once received immediate answers now waited a few hours, sometimes a day. Not out of spite, but out of recalibration. I needed to see what would happen if I wasn't instantly available. Nothing collapsed. That alone was revealing. I adjusted my schedule quietly. Commitments I had treated as immovable suddenly became flexible. I stopped rearranging my own plans to accommodate everyone else's. If something conflicted, I let the conflict exist instead of resolving it preemptively. No one commented, because they hadn't noticed yet. I revisited financial arrangements with the same quiet precision. Automatic payments were reviewed, not canceled, yet but questioned. I marked which expenses were essential, which were habitual, and which had no clear purpose anymore beyond convenience. I noticed how many things I had been paying for simply because I always had. Support had slowly replaced responsibility. I didn't announce changes. I didn't warn anyone. I just stopped expanding. And without expansion, systems reveal their dependence. Small gaps appeared, not emergencies, not crises, just moments of mild inconvenience, a delayed pickup, a forgotten payment, a scheduling conflict that required someone else to step in. Each time, I watched how quickly they adapted, faster than I expected. That taught me something important. They weren't helpless. They were accustomed to me filling in the spaces before they became visible. I also paid attention to my own reactions. The instinct to apologize surfaced quickly. So did the urge to explain. Years of conditioning don't disappear overnight. But I resisted both. No apologies. No explanations. Just neutrality. I began saying things like, "I won't be able to do that," without adding reasons. I let the sentence end where it should have ended all along. At first it felt abrupt, unkind even, but clarity often feels harsh to those used to access. I noticed the change in tone before I noticed the change in behavior. Questions replaced assumptions, requests replaced declarations. It was subtle, but it was there. They were adjusting, not because I had demanded anything, but because the environment had changed. And environments shape behavior more effectively than arguments ever could. I stopped measuring my value by how much I contributed. I stopped equating usefulness with belonging. That mental shift mattered more than any external adjustment. For the first time, I felt in control of my own pace. I didn't owe anyone constant availability. I didn't owe anyone my silence, and I certainly didn't owe anyone an explanation for choosing myself after years of choosing everyone else. What surprised me most was how calm I felt. Not triumphant, not bitter, just steady, like someone who had finally aligned their actions with a truth they had been avoiding. I hadn't confronted anyone, but I had changed the terms, quietly, deliberately, without asking permission. I didn't announce my withdrawal, I just stopped overextending. And in that restraint, I reclaimed something I hadn't realized I'd lost: agency. I didn't announce anything. There was no speech, no warning, no emotional conversation meant to explain my decision. I had learned by then that explanations invite negotiation, and negotiation assumes that my boundaries were open for discussion. They weren't. So I withdrew the way I had always given, quietly, consistently, without spectacle. The first thing I stopped doing was staying available by default. I no longer kept my days open just in case someone needed me. If I had plans, I kept them. If I needed rest, I took it. I didn't rearrange my life to fit around everyone else's needs before considering my own. It felt unfamiliar at first, almost irresponsible, but only because I had been trained to believe that my presence was mandatory. Then I stopped providing childcare, not dramatically, not with an announcement. I simply said, "I won't be able to watch the kids this week." No excuses, no apologies, just a statement of fact. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a longer pause than usual. That pause told me everything. They hadn't expected resistance, they had expected adjustment. When I didn't offer an alternative solution, when I didn't suggest another day or rearrange my schedule to soften the refusal, confusion followed, then mild irritation, then questions framed as concern. "Are you feeling okay?" "You've never said no before." "We're just surprised." Surprised, as if my availability had been a law of nature, not a choice. I remained calm enough to hear what they weren't saying, calm enough to notice how quickly inconvenience translated into discomfort, calm enough to understand that this moment wasn't about the children, it was about access. I also stopped covering expenses that had quietly become expected, not all at once, just the ones that had no clear reason beyond habit. Bills I had been paying out of convenience, subscriptions I wasn't using, costs that benefited everyone except me. Again, no announcement, just a shift. Money moved differently when it stopped flowing automatically. People noticed that before they noticed anything else. Financial dependence has a way of revealing itself quickly when the support behind it loosens. Questions followed, carefully phrased at first, then more directly. "Did something change? Are you upset with us? We didn't know you felt this way." I didn't answer those questions, because the premise was wrong. This wasn't about feelings, it was about structure. I had been carrying responsibilities that weren't mine. I had been filling roles I had never agreed to permanently, and I had done it for so long that everyone assumed I would continue. Assumptions don't dissolve on their own, they have to be interrupted. So I interrupted them. I stopped being always ready. I stopped responding immediately. I stopped preemptively solving problems that weren't brought to me directly. I stopped anticipating needs before they were voiced. And the world did not end. Schedules adjusted. Alternatives appeared. Other arrangements were made. Slowly, reluctantly, but effectively. That realization brought an unexpected sense of peace. They didn't need me as much as they believed. They just preferred me because I was easier, and I had been easy for a very long time. I noticed how my calm unsettled them more than anger ever could. Anger would have given them something to react to, something to dismiss or challenge. Calm offered no such opening. I wasn't withdrawing out of spite. I was stepping back out of clarity. There is a difference. I didn't cancel their vacation. I canceled my unpaid role in their lives. And in doing so, I began to feel something I hadn't felt in years. Lightness, not happiness, not relief, just space. The pushback didn't come all at once. It arrived gradually, testing the edges of what I had changed, as if they were trying to determine whether this new version of me was temporary or real. At first, they treated it like a misunderstanding, a phase, something that would pass if ignored long enough. Requests returned, phrased more carefully this time. Softer, almost polite. "Just this once. Only for a few hours. We don't have anyone else." Each request came with the expectation that I would bend, just slightly, to prove that nothing fundamental had shifted. I didn't. I repeated myself without raising my voice. I said no the same way each time, without adding explanations, without filling the silence that followed. I let the discomfort sit where it belonged. That was new for all of us. The guilt surfaced quickly, as it always does when patterns are broken. I felt it in my chest, familiar and sharp, urging me to smooth things over, to restore balance by sacrificing myself again. That instinct had been carefully cultivated over years, but this time I noticed it. And noticing made all the difference. I reminded myself that guilt wasn't evidence of wrongdoing. It was evidence of change. A signal that I was no longer behaving in ways others had grown comfortable relying on. They tried different approaches. Concern. You seem distant lately. Confusion. We don't understand what's going on. Subtle accusation. You've changed. That one almost made me smile. Of course I had changed. I had stopped pretending that my limits were negotiable. What struck me was how quickly my refusal was framed as personal rather than practical, as if setting boundaries were an emotional offense rather than a logistical adjustment, as if my autonomy required justification. I didn't take the bait. I didn't defend myself. Defensiveness would have implied doubt, and I had none. I watched as they began to feel the absence of what I had quietly provided for years, not all at once but in moments, small disruptions, minor inconveniences, things they had never needed to think about before because I had always handled them. Now they had to, and they didn't like it. There were hints of resentment, glances exchanged, conversations that stopped when I entered the room, then resumed in a different tone. I recognized the pattern. I had lived inside it long enough to know what it meant. They were adjusting to the loss of access. That adjustment came with frustration, but frustration is not an emergency. I let it exist. What surprised me was how quickly the emotional weight shifted. The more consistently I held my boundaries, the lighter I felt. The heaviness I had carried for years, the constant sense of obligation, the quiet anxiety of being needed, began to loosen. I slept better. I moved through my days without anticipating interruptions. I realized how much of my mental energy had been spent managing other people's expectations, and how freeing it was to simply stop. They noticed the difference, not because I announced it, but because I no longer rushed to fill the spaces they left unattended. I no longer softened my refusals. I no longer volunteered myself as the solution before a problem had even been named. And the most important change of all happened quietly, without ceremony. I stopped feeling guilty, not immediately, not all at once, but gradually. As each boundary held without catastrophe, the guilt lost its power. It had been fueled by fear of rejection, fear of conflict, fear of being seen as selfish. None of those fears materialized in the way I had imagined. There was tension, yes, discomfort, adjustment, but there was also respect, not spoken, not acknowledged, but present, because consistency teaches people what to expect, and I had become consistent in a new way. I wasn't angry. I wasn't cold. I was simply no longer available for roles I had never agreed to play forever. That realization settled in me with a calm I hadn't known before. I hadn't taken anything from them. I had taken myself back. And once I did, there was no desire to return to who I had been before. They didn't notice right away, not in the way I once imagined they might, with concern or reflection or an uncomfortable moment of self-awareness. What they noticed first was disruption, things not working as smoothly as they used to, plans requiring adjustment, small inconveniences piling up where ease had once existed. That was when my absence became visible. Calls came more frequently, though the tone had changed. Less casual, more urgent. Requests were framed as questions, but carried an undercurrent of expectation, as if I were still supposed to step in just slightly delayed. When I didn't, irritation crept in. "You've been hard to reach lately," my son said one evening, his voice tight, controlled. Not worried. Annoyed. I listened without interrupting, letting the silence stretch longer than he was comfortable with. I could hear it in his breathing. The moment he realized I wasn't rushing to reassure him. "We just need some help," he continued. "Things have been a little complicated." Complicated. That word did a lot of work. It covered the inconvenience of rearranged schedules, the discomfort of having to solve problems independently, the frustration of losing a resource that had always been reliable. What it didn't cover was accountability. No one said, "We miss you." No one said, "We treated you unfairly." No one said, "We should have talked to you." Instead, the narrative shifted. "You've changed," he said finally, as if naming a flaw, as if change itself were an accusation. I almost laughed. Change had been inevitable. What surprised me was how threatening it seemed to them. I realized then that my consistency had been mistaken for permanence. They had built their lives assuming I would remain exactly as I was, available, agreeable, quietly supportive, while everything else evolved. When I stepped out of that role, even partially, it disrupted more than logistics. It disrupted entitlement. They didn't say the word, of course. Entitlement rarely announces itself. It hides behind familiarity, behind phrases like, "We've always done it this way," behind the belief that access, once granted, doesn't need to be renewed. I heard it in the way my son spoke. "We're family," he said, as if that explained everything. Family, in his mind, meant obligation without negotiation. It didn't occur to him that family should also mean respect. The conversations grew tenser after that. Shorter, sharper around the edges. There was less patience now, less effort to sound understanding. The concern that had once softened their requests gave way to irritation when my answers didn't change. They weren't angry because I had hurt them. They were angry because I wasn't fixing things for them anymore. That distinction mattered. I noticed how quickly responsibility was redirected toward me, how easily inconvenience turned into blame. "If you'd just help a little. If you hadn't pulled back so suddenly. This wouldn't be such a problem." Suddenly. As if years of quiet overextension could be erased with that word. As if my withdrawal had come without warning, rather than being the natural response to being excluded, assumed, and overlooked. Still, no one apologized. Not for the trip. Not for the decisions made without me. Not for the way my absence had been treated as an inconvenience rather than a loss. That silence was loud. It told me that what they wanted wasn't reconciliation, it was restoration. They wanted things to go back to the way they were, without examining why that arrangement no longer worked for me. I stayed calm through it all, not detached, just grounded. I had already mourned what I needed to mourn. What remained was clarity. I understood now that their discomfort wasn't a sign I had done something wrong. It was a sign that I had stopped doing what benefited them at my own expense, and that was not something I needed to apologize for. I listened more than I spoke. When I did speak, I chose my words carefully, not to persuade, but to state. There was no pleading in my voice, no attempt to soften the truth. I wasn't asking for understanding. I was establishing reality. They noticed my absence only when it inconvenienced them. That realization settled between us, unspoken but undeniable. And once it did, there was no going back to pretending otherwise. After that, the tone shifted completely. There was less pretending, less softness in their words. The patience they had shown when they thought my withdrawal was temporary began to wear thin. The assumption that I would eventually return to my old role no longer felt secure, and with that came frustration. They started speaking to me as if I were the problem that needed fixing. Not directly, not openly. But in the way blame slipped into conversation, disguised as disappointment. "We just don't understand why you're doing this. This isn't like you. You're making things harder than they need to be." Harder for whom, I wondered. Each comment carried the same message. My boundaries were an inconvenience, and inconveniences were unacceptable when they interfered with the rhythm they were used to. There was no mention of the vacation, no acknowledgement of the decision to exclude me, no recognition of how that moment might have affected me. That omission was intentional. Addressing it would have meant confronting the imbalance that had existed long before the trip. Instead, they focused on my reaction, as if the problem weren't the exclusion, but my refusal to absorb it quietly. Guilt became the tool of choice. It arrived subtly at first. A sigh here, a long pause there, a reminder of how much they were struggling, how overwhelmed they felt, how difficult everything had become since I stepped back. I listened. I said nothing, because guilt loses its power when it's named internally. They weren't appealing to my compassion. They were appealing to my conditioning. They assumed I would respond the way I always had, by minimizing myself to restore comfort, by apologizing for disrupting a system that had never been fair, but something in me had already disengaged from that script. The clearest moment came during a phone call I will never forget. My son was quiet at first, his breathing heavy on the line. Then he spoke, his voice edged with something between accusation and disbelief. "You've really changed," he said. "You're not the same anymore." He didn't say it with concern. He said it like a warning, as if my transformation were a betrayal. I waited a moment before responding, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to be precise. "I'm not the same," I said calmly. "I don't have the same capacity I used to." There was silence on the line, not reflective silence, uncomfortable silence, because for the first time I wasn't denying the change, I was naming it. That was when the mask finally slipped. He didn't ask how I was doing. He didn't ask what had led me here. He didn't apologize. Instead, he said, "Well, we're really struggling without your help." Without your help, not without you. That distinction landed hard. In that moment, everything became clear. They didn't miss my presence. They missed my function. They missed the version of me that smoothed things over, paid quietly, stayed available, filled gaps without being asked. They missed the convenience of my silence, the reliability of my sacrifice, and they resented me for taking it back. I felt no urge to argue, no need to explain, no desire to defend myself, because nothing I could say would change what that sentence revealed. They hadn't lost a relationship, they had lost a resource. I ended the call politely, not abruptly, just decisively. I set the phone down and sat there for a long time afterward, letting the truth settle fully. It didn't hurt the way I thought it would. It clarified. I understood then that waiting for an apology was pointless. Apologies require recognition of harm, and recognizing harm would mean admitting that they had benefited from my silence for far too long. They weren't ready for that. And I was done waiting. I didn't feel angry. I felt finished. Finished trying to earn a place I should never have had to negotiate. Finished explaining boundaries to people who only noticed them when they interfered with their comfort. They had noticed my absence, but only when it inconvenienced them. And once I understood that, I stopped hoping for anything more from them. Understanding didn't arrive with relief. It arrived quietly, like dusk settling over a familiar street, changing the light without changing the place. Nothing dramatic happened, no apology, no confrontation, just a gradual clarity that made everything else fall into place. It was never about the vacation. Not really. That trip was only the moment when something already fragile finally broke the surface. A visible outcome of decisions made long before tickets were purchased or bags were packed. The real shift had happened quietly, over years, in small allowances and unspoken adjustments that slowly moved me out of the center without my noticing. I began to see it clearly then. I wasn't forgotten. I was replaced. Not by another person exactly, but by an idea, an arrangement, a version of family that no longer had room for me unless I was useful. They didn't remove me all at once. That would have required confrontation. Instead, they redefined me, reduced me to a role that existed on the margins, available when needed, invisible when not. Once I saw that, the anger I thought I should feel never arrived. What came instead was sadness, not sharp, not consuming, just heavy, the kind of sadness that settles when you realize you've been mourning something long before you knew it was gone. I walked alone more often then, not to escape, but to think. In the evenings, when the light softened and the world felt less demanding, I let myself replay the story without defending anyone, without blaming myself. I looked at it as it was, not as I had hoped it might be. I saw how easily my presence had been taken for granted, how quickly "she'll handle it" had turned into "she doesn't need to be included," how comfort had replaced consideration and convenience had replaced care. I also saw my part in it, not as guilt, as recognition. I had allowed myself to become predictable, reliable to the point of erasure. I had equated love with endurance, belonging with usefulness. I had believed that staying quiet was the same as keeping peace. It wasn't. It was simply making space for others to decide without me. That realization hurt, but it didn't destroy me. It steadied me. For the first time, I wasn't trying to reclaim my place. I wasn't asking to be seen again. I wasn't waiting for validation or understanding. I was accepting a truth that had been quietly shaping my life for years. My place in that family had changed, and pretending otherwise would only prolong the pain. I thought about how often I had stayed silent to avoid conflict, how often I had chosen ease over honesty, how often I had told myself that being needed was enough. It wasn't. Being needed is not the same as being valued. And once that distinction became clear, something else followed. Freedom. Not the loud kind, not the celebratory kind, the quiet kind. The kind that comes when you stop fighting reality and start aligning yourself with it. I didn't need to be invited anymore, because invitations imply permission, and I no longer needed anyone's permission to exist fully in my own life. That understanding didn't erase the sadness. It softened it, turned it into something manageable, something that could be carried without bitterness. I wasn't forgotten, I was replaced. And knowing that allowed me to stop chasing a version of family that no longer included me in the way I deserved. Once I accepted that truth, I stopped trying to correct it. There was no urge left to argue my way back into a space that had quietly moved on without me. No desire to remind anyone of everything I had done, everything I had given, everything I had absorbed in silence. That accounting no longer mattered. What mattered was what I did next. I began to measure my worth differently, not by how much I could carry, or how many problems I could solve, or how available I remained when others called. I measured it by how I felt in my own presence, in the quiet moments when no one needed anything from me. And for the first time in a long while, those moments felt steady. I spent evenings walking alone, watching the light fade and the world slow down. There was something grounding about being by myself without feeling abandoned. I wasn't alone because I had been left behind. I was alone because I chose to be present with myself. That distinction changed everything. I no longer waited for messages that didn't come. I no longer replayed conversations looking for what I might have said differently. I didn't check in out of habit or obligation. I let silence exist without trying to fill it. The silence didn't punish me. It healed me. I realized how much of my life I had spent orienting myself around others, anticipating their needs, adjusting my behavior, minimizing my own to keep things smooth. That way of living had once felt like love. Now it felt like erasure. Letting go of that pattern wasn't dramatic. It was gentle. It happened in small decisions that no one else noticed. Choosing not to respond immediately, choosing not to volunteer, choosing not to explain. Each choice returned something to me: time, energy, attention. I stopped expecting recognition from people who had grown comfortable overlooking me. Expectation is where disappointment lives. When I released it, disappointment had nowhere to settle. There was sadness, yes, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It moved through me instead of lodging itself inside me. I didn't resent them. Resentment would have kept me tied to a story that no longer served me. I also didn't feel the need to forgive them in any formal way. Forgiveness, I realized, isn't always necessary for peace. Understanding is often enough. I understood that they hadn't set out to replace me. They had simply adapted to a version of family where my presence wasn't essential unless it was useful. And I had adapted too. But in a different direction. I had chosen to step into a life where my value didn't depend on how convenient I was to others, where my place wasn't conditional, where my worth didn't require constant proof. That was the justice, not retribution, not confrontation, alignment. I aligned my life with my truth instead of their expectations, and in doing so, I removed myself from harm. I wasn't forgotten. I was replaced. But I also replaced something else. The belief that love must be earned through endurance. The belief that staying silent keeps peace. The belief that being needed is enough. I walked home that evening as the sun disappeared behind the houses, my shadow stretching long across the pavement. I felt no triumph, no bitterness, just a quiet sense of rightness. I didn't need to be seen anymore. I could see myself, and that was enough. Choosing myself didn't feel like rebellion. There was no dramatic break, no announcement, no moment where I declared anything out loud. It felt quieter than that, almost ordinary, like finally taking a deep breath after years of shallow ones and realizing this was how breathing was supposed to feel all along. I began planning my days without checking anyone else's calendar first. That small change mattered more than I expected. I woke up and asked myself what I wanted to do, not what needed to be done, not what someone else might need from me, just what felt right for the day ahead. Sometimes the answer was simple: a walk, a book, a cup of coffee enjoyed slowly instead of in between tasks. Other times, the answer surprised me. I found myself thinking further ahead than I had in years, not in terms of obligation, but possibility, where I might go, what I might learn, how I might spend time without explaining or justifying it to anyone. For so long, my life had been reactive, responding, adjusting, accommodating. Choosing myself meant becoming intentional again. I noticed how unfamiliar that felt at first. There was a hesitation that lingered, a reflex to pause and wonder if I was being selfish. That voice didn't disappear immediately. It surfaced quietly, asking questions it had been trained to ask for decades. Shouldn't I check with them first? Wouldn't it be easier to wait? What if someone needs me? I listened to that voice without obeying it, and with each choice I made for myself, it grew softer. I didn't stop caring about my family. That part of me didn't vanish, but care no longer meant constant availability. Love no longer required self-erasure. I allowed those definitions to evolve, even if no one else noticed. I made plans that existed only for me. I signed up for things without coordinating schedules. I committed to experiences without building in escape routes. I learned to trust that I could follow through, not because someone depended on me, but because I wanted to. That trust rebuilt something inside me. I felt more present, more awake, less divided. I wasn't rushing anymore. Not toward approval, not toward usefulness, not toward being needed. My days stretched out in front of me, open in a way they hadn't been in a long time. There was grief mixed into that freedom. I won't pretend otherwise. Some mornings, the quiet felt heavy. The absence of familiar demands left space for old memories to surface. Moments where I wondered what things might have been like if I had spoken up sooner, if I had claimed my place earlier. But regret didn't take over, because regret assumes there is still something to fix. I wasn't fixing my past. I was choosing my future. I stopped waiting for invitations that might never come, not out of bitterness but out of acceptance. Waiting keeps you anchored to other people's decisions. Choosing yourself means moving forward regardless. I didn't need to be included to feel whole. That realization changed how I saw everything. I planned a trip, nothing extravagant, nothing symbolic, just something I wanted to do. I chose the destination without compromise. I booked it without asking anyone's opinion. I didn't leave room for anyone else's preferences to override my own. It felt strange at first, then it felt empowering. I wasn't proving anything. I wasn't making a statement. I was simply living. And that, I realized, was the most honest response to everything that had come before. The first trip I truly enjoyed was the one I took alone, not because I wanted solitude, but because I wanted honesty. I wanted to experience something without adjusting myself to fit anyone else's pace, preferences, or expectations. I wanted to see what it felt like to move through the world on my own terms. I chose the destination quietly, without consulting anyone, without explaining my reasons. There was no grand symbolism behind it. I didn't need it to represent freedom or closure. I just needed it to be mine. Packing felt different this time. There was no checklist written for someone else, no extra items added just in case. I packed what I needed and nothing more. That simplicity followed me as I left the house, locking the door behind me with a sense of calm I hadn't anticipated. On the road, I noticed things I used to miss. The way light changed through the window, the rhythm of my own thoughts when they weren't interrupted, the quiet satisfaction of making small decisions, where to stop, when to rest, what to do next, without negotiation. I wasn't lonely. I felt present. There were moments when old habits tried to return, a reflex to reach for my phone, to share updates, to check in out of routine. I let those impulses pass, not out of resentment but out of respect for the space I was creating for myself. I didn't need witnesses to validate my experience. Each day unfolded gently. Mornings began without urgency. I woke when I was ready, not when I was needed. I spent time wandering without a schedule, allowing curiosity to guide me instead of responsibility. I sat with myself in ways I hadn't in years, and in that stillness, I felt something shift. The weight I had carried, quiet, persistent, unnamed, began to lift, not suddenly, gradually, as if my body was learning a new posture after years of tension. I realized how much of my life had been lived in anticipation, anticipating needs, anticipating requests, anticipating disappointment. Being alone, by choice, removed that constant vigilance. There was nothing to anticipate, only experience. I didn't think about my family much during that trip, not because they didn't matter, but because my thoughts were no longer anchored to their expectations. When they did cross my mind, it was without sharpness, without resentment, just awareness. I had stepped into a different relationship with them. One defined by choice, not obligation. One where my presence, when offered, would be intentional. As the trip came to an end, I felt no rush to return to who I had been. I carried the quiet with me, letting it settle into my daily life. I kept the boundaries I had set. I maintained the pace I had discovered. Nothing dramatic happened after that. No reconciliation scene, no confrontation, no apology. And I didn't need one. Because closure doesn't always come from others. Sometimes it comes from within, when you stop waiting for permission to live fully. I watched the sunrise one morning, standing still as the light warmed my face. I thought about how many years I had spent standing in the background of other people's lives, waiting to be called forward. That waiting was over. I wasn't choosing distance. I was choosing myself. And for the first time, my life wasn't under review. It was simply mine.